In 1984, on a single block of 42th Street in Times Square, between 7th Avenue and 8th in Manhattan, the New York City Police Department recorded 2,300 crimes. 20% of them were felonies. Murder, rape. That is more than 6 crimes a day on one block, every day for a year. The same block was the most famous stretch of pavement in the country. Broadway ran through it. So did the eastern terminus of the first coast-to-coast road ever built for the automobile. The subway station beneath it, part of the Times Square 42th Street complex, the busiest in New York, had been the busiest in the system for decades. The New York Times had once had its headquarters on it. The ball had been dropping on New Year's Eve at the north end of it since 1907. And in 1984, on the entire 13-acre core of Times Square, the whole notorious middle of the crossroads of the world, legal businesses employed 3,000 people, and the city collected $6 million in property taxes, less than a single medium-sized office building elsewhere in Manhattan produced. This is the story of how the most famous block in America became the most dangerous, and of the specific instruments that erased it: a law, a lease, a movie studio, a zoning rule, and a basement full of crossword puzzles. Before it was Times Square, it was Longacre Square, named after London's carriage district, because that is what New Yorkers made and sold on the site. William Henry Vanderbilt ran the American Horse Exchange on the block that became the Winter Garden Theater in 1911. Before Vanderbilt, the land had belonged to John Jacob Astor, and before Astor, to a Revolutionary War general named John Morin Scott, who had a manor house at what is now 43rd Street. By the 1890s, the district was called the Thieves' Lair. Prostitution and low entertainment were pushing north from the old Tenderloin, and in 1895, on the block, a cigar manufacturer and impresario named Oscar Hammerstein I built a theater. He called it the Olympia. He would later build another one in 1900, called the Theater Republic, and describe it as the perfect parlor theater, a drawing room of the drama dedicated to all that is best in dramatic and lyric art. That theater is still there. It is the oldest working theater in Times Square. But it is a different building now, and it will take us most of this story to understand why. In 1904, the publisher of the New York Times, a man named Adolph Ochs, moved his newspaper's offices to a new skyscraper at 42th Street and Broadway, on the site of the recently opened Pabst Hotel. He persuaded the mayor to build him a subway station there, and he persuaded the city to change the name of the square. On April 8, 1904, Longacre became Times Square. 3 weeks later, the first electrified advertisement in the neighborhood appeared on the side of a bank at 46th Street. Ochs threw a fireworks show off the roof of the Times Tower on New Year's Eve 1904 to celebrate the name. 200,000 people came. The city banned rooftop fireworks a few years later because ash was falling on the crowd. So Ochs asked his chief electrician, a man named Walter Palmer, to build something else. What Palmer built was a 5-foot iron and wood ball weighing 700 pounds, wired with 100 incandescent bulbs. It was lowered from the flagpole 1 second after midnight on December 31, 1907. It has been lowered every New Year's Eve since, except in 1942 and 1943, when the city was blacked out for the war. That is how the name Times Square takes hold, and how its most famous ritual begins. A publisher wanting foot traffic, a ban on fireworks. A Ukrainian metalworker named Jacob Starr, who built the ball and founded a sign company called Artcraft Strauss that would end up lowering it for 80 years. The advertising man who coined the phrase, "the Great White Way," was named O.J. Good, and he coined it in 1901, before Times Square was even called Times Square. He was talking about the electric light. More of it burned in this district than anywhere else in New York, more of it than anywhere else in the country, and by the 1920s, more of it than almost anywhere else on Earth. Keep the Great White Way in mind. Its part in this story is not finished. The theaters came uptown from Union Square and Madison Square because the real estate on 42th Street was cheaper. Then, once one impresario built, another built next door. In a single decade, 11 theaters went up on one block of West 42th Street between 7th and 8th. On the south side of the street, the New Amsterdam, the Harris, the Liberty, the Eltinge, and the Lou Fields. On the north side, the Lyric, the Apollo, the Times Square Theater, the Victory, the Selwyn, and Hammerstein's Victoria, all within about 200 yards. The New Amsterdam opened on October 26, 1903. Klaw and Erlanger, the two most powerful producers of the Broadway theatrical syndicate, had commissioned it from the architects Hertz and Talent. They gave it a Beaux-Arts exterior and an Art Nouveau interior of painted plaster, carved stone, murals, and tiles. The stage was the largest ever built for a legitimate theater. The capacity was 1,702 seats. A second, smaller theater sat on the roof. Beginning in 1913 and continuing every year until 1927, the New Amsterdam was the home of the Ziegfeld Follies. Florenz Ziegfeld ran a nightclub on that rooftop. His reviews put Fanny Brice and W.C. Fields on the stage downstairs and made his chorus girls, the Ziegfeld Girls, into a national brand. The 1927 and 1928 Broadway season was the biggest in American theatrical history. More than 250 shows opened. More than 70 legitimate theaters were running in the district. The neon light had just been invented that year, and it was going up on the marquees. In the same season, Ziegfeld opened his own theater 4 blocks north on 6th Avenue, and on December 27, 1927, in that theater, Showboat opened and ran for 572 performances. The economics were startling. Over the course of the 1920s, advertising revenue in Times Square grew from $25 million a year to $85 million. A single billboard, the Wrigley Spearmint Gum sign, possibly the biggest electric sign in the world, rented for $9,000 a month. $9,000 a month in 1928. Remember that number. Its opposite arrives before the story ends. Then, in August 1945, a crowd came into Times Square to hear news it was expecting. On the evening of the 14th, the zipper news ticker on the Times Tower carried the words, "Official. Truman announces Japanese surrender." By 10 o'clock that night, 2 million people filled the square. It was the largest crowd Times Square had ever held. It is still the largest. The Depression had already started the unraveling. When the money went out of the audience in 1929, the theaters had to find something else to sell. Some closed, some went to burlesque. Most, in the end, went to movies. In 1937, the New Amsterdam Theater stopped putting on plays and started showing films. In 1933, the Ziegfeld Theater had already made the same conversion. By 1943, all 10 of the theaters on 42th Street, between 7th and 8th, were movie houses, and Variety magazine was calling the block the biggest movie center in the world. That is not yet the decline. That is the compromise that kept the buildings standing. The decline arrives in 1960, in the pages of the New York Times, in a piece by a reporter named Milton Bracker, with a title that would attach itself to that block for the next 35 years, Life on West 42th Street. A study in decay, Bracker called the block, plainly, the worst block in town. The paper of record had said out loud what New Yorkers had been noticing quietly for a decade, but the industrial reorganization of that block was still 6 years away, and when it came from an unexpected direction. It came from a basement in New Jersey. In 1966, a shoe-shine man and newspaper seller from Brooklyn named Martin Hodas found a set of abandoned film loop projection machines in the basement of a New Jersey business. He fed them pornography, and he installed the first one in the back of a bookstore on 42th Street. It was a quarter to look. It played for less than a minute. Hodas claimed he made $30,000 in a single week. Within 2 years, he had opened his own theater on 42th Street, called Fun City, at 113 West 42th. The press called him the King of the Peeps. In 1965, before Hodas walked into the basement, 9 adult businesses operated in the entire city of New York, all 5 boroughs. 9. Keep that number 2. Its work in this story is not finished. 1972 is the pivot year, the year the model went national. In June, a movie called Deep Throat opened. It had been made in a Florida hotel by a director billing himself as Jerry Gerard, whose real name was Gerard Damiano, and it starred a young woman under the stage name Linda Lovelace. The budget was $47,500. The producers were reported to be connected to the Colombo crime family. Linda Lovelace was paid $1,250. The movie ran 61 minutes. It grossed between $30 and $50 million. Deep Throat is the reason the sex industry stopped being a marginal business in Times Square and became the dominant business. Once a mob-funded pornographic film with a 61-minute runtime could pay its investors back 1,000 times over, the calculation on 42th Street changed. Every peep booth, every adult bookstore, every rundown movie house that could still be flipped was flipped, and behind the flipping stood the mob. By the early 1970s, a Genovese crime family capo named Matthew Ianiello, nicknamed Matty the Horse, controlled, by one estimate, nearly every sex shop and pornographic club on Times Square. He took protection money from the bar owners and the peddlers and the topless dancers. A former New York Times organized crime reporter later called him a huge moneymaker for the mob. Ianiello would eventually be sentenced to 9 years for racketeering and tax evasion and would go to prison in 1986. He would come out in 1995. By then, the block he had built would be almost gone. Under Ianiello and under his rivals, the industry consolidated. In 1977, the year the block found its flagship, a real estate operator named Richard Bassiano opened a 4-story emporium at 669 8th Avenue on the corner of 42th and called it Show World Center. The retail space was 22,000 square feet. Bassiano spent $400,000 fitting it out with an adult bookstore, video peep booths, live one-on-one fantasy booths, and a small theater called the Triple Treat. He lived in a penthouse on the top 3 floors of the same building. A city official later called Show World the McDonald's of sex. The New Yorker called it the Saks of Sleaze. That is 1977, and the same year, a lawyer in the Beamy administration named Sidney Baumgarten, the mayor's smut czar, was writing a piece of legislation called the Nuisance Abatement Law, which we will come back to. That same year, a nonprofit called the 42th Street Development Corporation, founded a year earlier by a real estate man named Fred Papert, elected Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis to its board. The most photographed woman in America was, quietly, working on the Deuce. The nickname was older than the mob and older than the porn. It comes from the number, 40 Deuce, Deuce being the card-playing name for a 2. It appears in print as early as April 1910 in the Washington Post, quoting the New York World. "Yes, I know where I ought to be right now, at the corner of 40 Deuces Street and the Big Road." 60 years before the film loops arrived, someone had already looked at that block and named it after the lowest card in the deck. By 1981, Rolling Stone was calling West 42th Street the sleaziest block in America. By the mid-80s, the 10-block area bounded by 40th and 50th Streets, 7th Avenue and 9th, was generating more than 15,000 crime complaints a year. And on the single block, on 42th between 7th and 8th, the number that opened this video, 2,300 crimes in 1984 alone. 20% of them felonies. The number of adult businesses in New York City, which had been 9 when Martin Hodas walked into that New Jersey basement, was, by 1993, 177, almost all of them in Manhattan. Most of them within a few blocks of that one address on 8th Avenue. The evening of December 2, 1979. The marquees on the block are still lit, advertising sweet cakes, Debbie Does Dallas, Kung Fu features. The neon rules the sidewalk. The subway station beneath 42th Street carries a crowd all night. The Port Authority bus terminal, 1 block west, sends off runaways and takes in more. On the block, A man named Richard Cottingham has checked into the Travel Inn Motor Hotel with two women. He is a computer technician from Lodi, New Jersey. He has 3 children. He is 33. The women are working. One is a 22-year-old immigrant from Kuwait named Dide Gudarzi. The other has never been identified. She is remembered in the case file only as Jane Doe. They go up to room 417. Later that night, first responders are called to room 417 for a fire. They open the door and find 2 burned bodies on the twin beds. The bodies have no heads and no hands. Cottingham has taken those with him, in a valise. The severed parts have never been found. Cottingham will keep killing sex workers in Times Square hotels for another 6 months. In May 1980, in a Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, he will pick up an 18-year-old named Leslie Ann Odell, and Odell will escape. The police will trace him from a fingerprint on the handcuffs he left behind. He will be tried between 1981 and 1984 for 11 murders, sentenced to a minimum of 192 years plus life, and he will still, decades later, be adding names to his confession list. The press will settle on the nicknames, the Torso Killer and the Times Square Ripper. He was not operating in isolation. In 1976 and 1977, David Berkowitz, son of Sam, had terrorized the city while Times Square was at its nadir. The murders splashed across tabloids sold in the same newsstands lining those sidewalks. The violence, the porn, the fear, they were not separate stories. They were the same city. For the New York City of 1984, the New York City drowning in 2,300 crimes on a single block, watching Taxi Driver and understanding that Martin Scorsese had not exaggerated much, Cottingham was not the anomaly. He was the logical end of the business model. The instruments used to erase the Deuce were, in the end, boring instruments. That is the interesting thing about them. They were not dramatic. They were not sudden. They were a law, a non-profit, a lease, and a corporation. The law came first. Sidney Baumgarten's nuisance abatement law was signed into effect in 1977. It gave the mayor's office the right to secure, at a secret hearing, a closing order against any business permitting prostitution or drug dealing on the premises. No indictment required. No revolving door arrest. The building was padlocked, and the police could search every room without a warrant. Within 5 years of the law's enactment, the number of sex businesses in the district had been nearly cut in half. The nonprofit came second. Fred Pappert's 42th Street Development Corporation, joined by Jacqueline Onassis, spent the late 1970s attempting to bring off-Broadway theaters to the far west end of 42th Street, hoping to squeeze the porn shops out one lease at a time. The mayor's Office of Midtown Enforcement had been quietly running its own campaign against the block since Mayor A.B.M. established it in January 1976. Its director in the mid-1980s, a man named William Daley, was the one who called Show World the McDonald's of sex. He meant it as an insult. Richard Basquiano took it as praise for his cleanliness. The big project came third. In 1980, Mayor Ed Koch announced what became known as the 42th Street Development Project. Its plan, unveiled on February 11, 1981, was called the 42th Street Redevelopment Plan, and its price tag was $2.6 billion. Under Governor Mario Cuomo, the state's Urban Development Corporation took the lead. In 1990, the state used its power of eminent domain to take possession of 6 of the 9 historic theaters on the block, and a non-profit, the new 42th Street, was created to hold and restore them. Which is where the number arrives. In May 1992, the new 42th Street signed a 99-year master lease with the state and the city for 7 of those theaters: the Apollo, the Empire, the Liberty, the Lyric, the Selwyn, the Victory, the Times Square Theater. 7 buildings whose original construction, 7 decades earlier, had generated the $85 million advertising economy of Broadway in the 1920s. The rent on the lease was $10 a year, $9,000 a month for a chewing gum billboard in 1928. $10 a year for 7 historic theaters in 1992. The block, at its lowest, was worth so little that only a symbolic price could bring in a party to take it. Even with the theaters under state control, the block itself was still the block. The people who paid the rent to Richard Basciano, and the people who worked in Show World and the 25 other adult establishments on the Strip were not going to leave because a landmark had changed hands. So the city changed the zoning. On October 25, 1995, an amendment to New York City's zoning resolution took effect. It said no adult establishment could operate within 500 feet of a residence, a school, a house of worship, or another adult establishment. It said adult establishments were capped at 10,000 square feet. And it said any business classified as an adult establishment had to devote no more than 40% of its floor space to adult material. The notorious 60-40 rule. Richard Basciano was, at that point, 69 years old. He had lived through Baumgarten. He had lived through the Office of Midtown Enforcement. He was not going to close Show World over a zoning rule, so he filled his basement with old crossword puzzle books, out-of-date TV guides, and back-issue magazines. Nobody bought them. Nobody was meant to. They took up 60% of his retail space and let the peep booths in the rest of the building keep running. The city sued. The Coalition for Free Expression, led by Basciano, sued back. The case ran to the New York Court of Appeals, and on February 24, 1998, the court ruled for the city. The 1995 zoning was upheld. In 2001, the city amended the rule further, closing the 60-40 loophole. The litigation went on for another 20 years, but Show World was not the pivot. The pivot was Disney. In April 1993, the chief executive of the Walt Disney Company, Michael Eisner, walked through the New Amsterdam Theater. The Ziegfeld Follies had run there for 14 years. Klaw and Erlanger had built it in 1902. The last movie had been shown in 1985. By the time Eisner walked in, the interior had collapsed ceilings and standing water on the floor. Eisner negotiated with the city for nearly a year. In February 1994, the deal was announced. The restoration would cost, depending on which number you use, somewhere between $29 and $36 million. Disney would put up $8 million. The city would loan the rest at extraordinarily favorable terms, with repayment beginning at $1 million a year once the theater opened. Eisner would sign a long-term lease. It is worth noting what was happening politically at the same time. Rudy Giuliani had been elected mayor in November 1993, partly on a platform of restoring order to the city's streets. His administration expanded the NYPD's quality of life enforcement, and Commissioner William Bratton's CompStat program, which tracked crime data block by block, gave police commanders the tools to measure exactly what was happening on any given stretch of pavement. On 42th Street, they already knew what was happening. Now they had a system built to prove when it stopped. Restoration of the New Amsterdam ran from 1995 to 1997. The theater reopened in April 1997. It has operated ever since as Disney's Broadway flagship. Beauty and the Beast had already opened at the Palace Theater in 1994, the first Disney theatrical production on Broadway, establishing the template. Then came The Lion King, Mary Poppins, Aladdin. Around Disney, everything else came in. Bertelsmann had bought 1540 Broadway in 1992. Morgan Stanley bought 1585 Broadway in August 1993 for $176 million, then bought 757th Avenue in 1994. Reuters opened its headquarters at 3 Times Square in 2001. Condé Nast moved into 4 Times Square. And the block that had been leased for $10 a year began to reopen, one theater at a time. The New Victory as a children's theater in December 1995, the Ford Center for the Performing Arts in December 1997, and the American Airlines Theater in July 2000. On the single block that had generated 2,300 crimes in 1984, the number of felonies committed in 1995 was 60. A city official told a reporter, in a line that survives in the record, that crime had reached such a low level on that block that they didn't keep statistics anymore. The number of adult businesses in New York City had grown from 9 in 1965 to 177 in 1993. It is today somewhere around 20. Richard Bassiano died on the 1st of May 2017. He was 92. His lawyer said he died a broken man. Show World Center was still open. The basement of his building still had shelves of old crossword puzzle books turning yellow, exactly where he had put them in 1995. Nobody had ever bought them. He had not needed anybody to. The next year, Show World, in its remaining form, closed. Martin Hodas had died in 2013 of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in Miami at the age of 82. He had, before he died, sold off the porn business he had built in Florida after the New York industry collapsed. Matty the Horse Ianiello had died in 2012 at 92 at his house in Old Westbury on Long Island. Sidney Baumgarten's 1977 nuisance law is still on the books. The Great White Way, the nickname that O.J. Good coined in 1901 for the electric billboard glow of Broadway, is still the nickname for Broadway. In 1987, at the tail end of the redevelopment fight, the city amended its zoning to require any large new building on Times Square to include large illuminated signs. It is the only district in New York City where the code specifies a minimum lighting level, not a maximum. In every other neighborhood, the law tells you how bright you may become. In Times Square, the law tells you how bright you must remain. The block itself is still there. The pavement of West 42th Street between 7th and 8th is the same pavement. The theaters on the north side of it include buildings the Selwyn brothers put up in 1920, and the theaters on the south side include the New Amsterdam that Hertz and Talent built in 1903, with restored plaster and restored paint and different names on the marquees. The Times Square Theater at 215 West 42th is still empty. Nobody has yet made the numbers work on a use for it. On an average day now, about 220,000 people cross the block. On a busy one, 330,000. The Times Square area generates approximately $4.8 billion a year in retail, entertainment, and hotel sales. Roughly 22 cents of every dollar a visitor spends in New York City is spent inside the district. The New Year's Eve ball still drops from the pole atop One Times Square 1 second after midnight, as it has done every year since 1907, except in 1942 and 1943. The building beneath the pole is no longer the New York Times headquarters. The paper sold the building in 1961. The Deuce, as a nickname for the block, is now used mostly by people who watch the HBO show and by tourists who remember the 70s. In 1984, on this block, 6 crimes were reported every day. In 1992, this block was leased for $10 a year. In 1997, one of these theaters reopened with a Disney musical for children, and the rest of the block followed within a decade. The $9,000 a month Wrigley sign is gone. The Wrigley Company still buys advertising in Times Square. So do Coca-Cola and Samsung. The signs are bigger now than they have ever been. The zoning requires them. The Great White Way is still white. Same lights, opposite meaning.